Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. I'm going to talk today about the use of antiviral treatment to curb the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a modeling study, and it's a collaboration with Elizabeth Brown, Myron Cohen, Dobromir Dimitrov, and Holly James. This is work that was recently published at VMC Infectious Diseases. And so let me start by saying a little bit about the motivation. So there are many antivirals on the way, and there are two that are already approved. So there are antivirals that are given in the hospital, such as remdesivir and monoclonal antibodies, and they are highly efficacious, but you have to go to the hospital to have them. And there are two oral treatments that receive emergency use authorization in the US. One of them is molnupiravir, who was shown to have 30% reduction in hospitalizations and deaths. And the other one is Paxlovid, which was shown to have 85% reduction in hospitalizations if it's taken within 5 days of symptoms. But more importantly, or not more importantly, but for this work, molnupiravir was shown to decrease viral load in a clinical trial. And so if this is true, and we expect that to be to some degree true for Paxlovid too, then we expect that the antiviral treatment will also decrease ongoing transmission. And so the objective of this work was to evaluate how much good antivirals could help in reducing ongoing COVID-19 transmission. And so the way we did this is we adapted a model, an agent-based model that was made by that is called Covacin. It was developed by Kerr et al. And I used 500,000 agents. And the original model was calibrated to Washington State. And so we just left most of the parameters as they were. And so the point of this model is that agents can meet at different locations, home, school, work, and other locations. This is on the right, you're seeing a schematic of how the model works. And so the beauty of this model is that you can adapt it for different countries. And so for each country, you can, the model will use particular demographics. And that is household composition and age distribution. And so what we did is we simulated a Delta-like and an Omicron-like wave with respective vaccination rates. And so a little bit more about how we changed this model. So we modified the vaccination so that it has three effects: reduction in susceptibility to infection, a reduction to symptoms given infection, and a reduction in severe disease given infection. That's for hospitalizations and deaths. And then on top of that, we added this antiviral treatment piece. And so we assume that antiviral will have two main effects. The first is an effect to reduce hospitalizations. This was the main result of clinical trials. And so it has an effect in reducing severe disease. And the second one is an antiviral effect on transmission. Oh, and that's a typo. It should be AVT, not E. And it's small as a reduction in viral load. So for each person who is receiving the antivirals, they will have a reduction in the viral load while on antivirals. And so we assume that the antiviral will reduce hospitalization by 88%, because that's what was found in clinical trials originally for Paxlovid, and we also did 30% as a sensitivity analysis. And we didn't know how much it will reduce transmission, so we assumed that it will reduce transmission by 25, 50, 75, or 100% reduction in viral load. And then we assume something that I'm gonna call a daily treatment initiation rate, and that's the number of symptomatic adults that every day will start treatment. And so we played with this number a lot. And so we assumed that you could either treat 2, 4, 6, 8, or from 10, 20, etc., all the way up to 100% of symptomatic adults. And we chose this because those are the ones who are eligible for Paxlovid at the moment. And so people who are receiving treatment can receive treatment within the first 5 days of symptoms, within the first 2 days of symptoms, or within these 3 to 5 days of symptoms. So we wanted to see how starting early or late will affect the results. And so we further consider 4 different populations in 4 different countries. So this is Kenya, Mexico, United States, and Belgium. And in this table, I put the percentage vaccinated for each wave that I'm considering. And so I want to point out that I chose these 4 countries because they have so different vaccination rates. And so Kenya has had 1.5 for their population vaccinated as of October, mid-October, when I did these works a year ago, and Belgium had the majority of their population vaccinated. And also the other interesting thing about these 4 populations is that they have very different demographics. And so I put a table here of the percentage of among adults that are over 30, over 50, over 65, and you can see that in Kenya, they have very little older adults, and in Belgium, they have almost a quarter of the adults that are older than 65. And so I want to show you the results for Omicron first. And so what I'm showing you here is the deaths averted, and I'm going to assume an Omicron type virus, and treatment started within 5 days of symptoms. And what you can see in each of these plots is the result for Kenya, Mexico, United States, Belgium, ordered by vaccination rates. And then on the y-axis, you're going to see deaths averted. And on this x-axis is this daily treatment initiation rate. So assuming that you could daily somehow recruit 2% of the symptomatic infections among adults, or the 4%, or et cetera, et cetera. And then the different colors that you cannot really see here because they all overlap, but you'll see later that they don't, represent what is the percentage of reduction that we assume in viral load. And so this purple one is 25% reduction, and this lime green is assuming that the antiviral will completely block transmission in the person receiving treatment. And so the first thing that you can see, of course, is that widespread use of antiviral treatment could be really good at averting large number of deaths. And so, for instance, if you were to treat 20% of the population of the symptomatic infections daily, you would already reduce 58% of the deaths. However, recruiting 20% of the symptomatic adults might be too much. But even if you were to recruit 6% of the symptomatic adults every day, you would already avert 20% of the deaths. And that's regardless of which country you are and what is the level of antiviral blocking transmission. And so what you're really seeing here is this direct effect of antiviral treatment, because these antivirals are very powerful at preventing hospitalizations and deaths. And then I want to show you what happens if now I assume a Delta type wave, and there's very little difference, even though Delta was far less transmissible in the model than Omicron. And what you can see here is that you're really seeing the direct effect of antiviral treatment. But then again, you would wonder, well, why would I treat all symptomatic adults? And so we further study, well, what if we targeted the antiviral treatment to those who are at higher risk? And so what we did is we consider now a cutoff age. So imagine that you will say the only people who can receive treatment are those who are 65 and older, or 50 and older, or 30 and older, or etc. And now again, you're seeing the deaths averted in each country: Kenya, Mexico, United States, and Belgium. But and for this particular exercise, we assume that you would treat 20% of the symptomatic infections in that group. So to be clear, for instance, in the 65 plus group, that means that I would treat 20% of all the symptomatic infections among the people who are 65 and older. And so here again, I repeated the little table that I showed you before so that you can have an idea of the percentage among adults who are, say, older than 65. And so what's striking is that if you were to treat, say, 20% of those who are older than 65, you would already have, you could avert 32% of deaths in Kenya and almost half of the deaths in Belgium. So it's huge. If you were to target the antivirals, you would have a huge effect in deaths. And that population is not huge. So for instance, in Kenya, there's only 3% of adults who are 65 and older. And so if you treat 20% of those, so it's not a big number really, you would already avert almost a third of the deaths. And so now I told you that we were interested in seeing what would be the effect of antivirals in transmission. And so then we looked at the infections averted. And so now it's a similar graph as I showed you before, but now instead of deaths averted, you have infections averted in the y-axis. And I put here to remind you what was the percentage of people vaccinated as of January 1st of this year, which is when I did this work in Kenya, was 8%, Mexico 56%, the US 62%, but there were 23% boosted, and in Belgium 76% vaccinated and 39% boosted. And what you can see is that as you move and you have more and more people vaccinated, there's a bigger and bigger effect in this antiviral treatment. And so there's this synergy between vaccination and antiviral treatment. And so if now I show you the same thing, but with Delta, because vaccination was more effective with Delta, this effect is even more pronounced. And so antiviral treatment of symptomatic infections for something that is Delta-like, so for a virus that was less transmissible than Omicron and that looks more like Delta in terms of vaccine effectiveness and transmission, this effect of this synergy between antivirals and vaccines is far more obvious, and you can see it. So for Kenya, you have very little transmission, infections prevented. As you go up in the countries that are more and more vaccinated, this effect is much more notorious. And then, as I said, we also investigated the effect of early versus late antiviral treatment. And so on the left, you're seeing treatment started within the first 2 days of symptoms. And on the right, you're seeing treatment started between days 3 and 5 of symptoms. And then again, on the y-axis, you're seeing infections averted. And on the x-axis, you're seeing this daily treatment initiation rate. And so each row is one country. And so what you can see is, again, this synergy between vaccines and antiviral treatment. But if you look at the right versus the left plots for each row, you can see that there's almost half of the infections are averted if you start late. So if, for instance, in Belgium, and if you look at this line, you can see that it reaches 30%. Well, if you start late, you reach around 15%. So you can prevent as much as twice as many infections if you start with early treatment. And then the last thing that I want to look at is what is the effect of pre-existing immunity on transmission. And so because I don't know exactly what's the level of previously infected people in the community, we did this sensitivity analysis where we assumed that we would have 20% of the people who had been already infected and are currently immune, or 40% in the middle column, or 60% on the right column. And so again, each row is a different country, with the y-axis being infections averted and the x-axis being the daily treatment initiation rate. And so what you can see is that if immunity is very low, as we think it is in the state where I live, in Washington State, then Omicron is way too transmissible to treat only symptomatic adults. And so you have this very little effect on transmission. And so it won't be enough to treat only symptomatic adults if you want to have an effect on transmission. In contrast, if immunity is very high, then antiviral treatment of symptomatic adults is and only symptomatic adults can be helpful in curbing transmission. And again, you have this stronger synergistic effect of vaccines and antivirals observed. And so, the conclusions are that the widespread use of antiviral treatments can avert a large number of deaths. And so, for instance, if you were to treat 20%, if you were to initiate treatment of 20% of symptomatic adults daily, you would already avert 60% of the deaths. But further, if you target this antiviral treatment to older adults, you could avert a third of the deaths by treating only 20% of symptomatic adults older than 65 years old. And so we saw that with a high transmissible variant, for which vaccines are not very effective, like Omicron, there's really very little effect of antiviral treatment in curbing infections if you only treat symptomatic adults. And we also have observed this synergistic effect between vaccination and antiviral treatment, and early treatment is key to reduce transmission. And I want to point out that I did this work before there was widespread use of Paxlovid, and so I didn't consider at all this rebound problem, which has emerged as something that one needs to consider when thinking about antiviral treatments. And with that, I want to thank you and thank my my funding sources, so the COVID-19 Prevention Network, the Fred Hutch, and NIH. And I'm happy to take any questions.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to chat or raise your hand. The raise your hand function is located in the reaction section. It was moved. That's a fairly new Zoom update. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions. It looks like we do have a question here. Go ahead, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you for a very great presentation. It was a very informative presentation. I have a question. I think you have mentioned that there is a synergy effect between using the vaccination and antiviral the drugs. And I think I a little bit missed the information. Can you explain a little bit more onto it? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So let me go back. Oops. Wait, that's not what I wanted to do. So if you look at here, so here I'm looking at infections averted for Omicron. Well, let me talk for Delta. I think it's far more obvious for Delta. So for Delta, if you look at how many people were vaccinated, Kenya had 1.5% vaccinated, Mexico had 38%, US had 57%, and Belgium had 74% vaccinated. And let's just look at US and Belgium because they have similar numbers, like similar distribution of demographics. So let me go back here. So if you look at these two columns of Belgium and US, you can see that their distribution of people is fairly similar. So it's, you know, like 70, 74, 40, 44, 19, 22. So US and Belgium are good comparators because they really are similar in demographics. And so you can, the only thing that is different, if you want, between the US and Belgium is the percentage vaccinated. And so by treating the same number of symptomatic adults in Belgium or in the US, you can see that if you focus in this line, say that represents a perfect antiviral that is blocking transmission perfectly, For the US, the most you will get is around 50% of infections averted, while for Belgium, that has roughly 15-20% more people vaccinated, for the same line, you will reach around 10% more people, more infections averted. Does that make sense? And so what that means, so this is the result of a combination of a vaccine that is working against transmission and the antivirals that are working against transmission together. So that's why I'm saying that there's a synergistic effect. And you can see that as there are more and more people vaccinated, if you look at the same lime green line for Mexico, that will reach only like less than 30%. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I found this is a very interesting methodology, and that was a very good explanation. And adding on to it, I have one more question. So you said that you will be able to compare these countries because their age demographics were kind of similar. But other than age demographics, are there other factors or confounding factors that can greatly affect, for instance, policy, especially the COVID policy and people's the acceptance of those policy interventions and other things that?
Yeah, for sure, those would be confounders in the real world, but in this particular model, the only thing that is, the things that are, the only things that are different are the structure of the population and the structure of the households. I mean, other than what I just showed you, like the percentage of vaccinated people. So because this is a model, yeah, I mean, for sure in the real world, Belgium was much better at, at following practices for distancing than the US, but I didn't take any of that into account. So, but you're right, that would be a thing in the real world, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a couple comments in the chat. One of them.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna read it. So it says,
sure.
I was wondering if you have considered supply constraints to antivirals like Paxlovid, since this might be a strong driver of infections averted, especially in low and middle income countries. Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I didn't, because I wanted to look at the if you want, the best case scenario where supply is not an issue. But you can kind of look at supply issues by just restricting where you look in this type of graphs, because I'm assuming, a certain percent of the population to be treated. So you can kind of translate that into how many antivirals you're using. But I didn't look into that. That's a good question though. And that's kind of like a next work if you wanted to say, okay, what's the best use of antivirals? And for instance, yesterday I read a news that Paxlovid, that Pfizer has agreed to share, I think, 6 million courses with low and middle income countries, which is definitely not a lot if you're gonna split that into 100+ countries. So yeah, it's gonna be a big issue. And then I'm seeing another question that says, did you consider effects of booster and on immunity waning? So for the booster part, so yes. So people that are boosted for the Omicron wave, people who are vaccinated but are not boosted have different vaccine effectiveness for the 3 effects that I said than people that are boosted. But I did not consider waning. And the reason is because I consider it, long story short, I didn't consider waning. But boosted people do have a much bigger effectiveness for the vaccines than people who are not boosted. And then the last question, definitely Laura, is this synergistic effect just a result of roughly proportional reduction applied to smaller RT, or is there something subtler going on here? No, I think you're definitely right. It is the effect of if you have more vaccine, it will reduce RT. So that's one thing. But I also think there's an effect of well, not for infections, but for VIDs, there is a certain effect of reducing the VIDs and the hospitalized, because there's a combined effect of vaccines also preventing hospitalizations. So, so in that sense, that's the only subtlety, if you want. But you're right that it is a reduction in RFT. So I think those are all the questions in the chat that I see. Am I missing anything?
Nope, that's all I see.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.